I turned 70 the night my daughter stood in my living room, lifted a microphone to her mouth and said, "Mom, you have become toxic to this family." She didn't rush it. She didn't soften it. She said it clearly, like someone presenting a conclusion after careful research, and 40 people sat in folding chairs watching my reaction as if they had come for a performance. My son stood beside her with printed pages in his hand. My neighbors avoided my eyes. And in that moment, before anyone explained anything, before a single example was given, I understood something chilling. This was not a conversation. It was a correction. They were not asking who I was. They had already decided. Behind them, taped to the wall where my husband's portrait used to hang during the holidays, was a banner in blue marker that read, "We love you enough to be honest." The cake I baked myself that afternoon was still in my hands, lemon with cream cheese frosting, the kind my children requested every birthday when they were small. I remember thinking how strange it was that there were no balloons, no music, no laughter, just rows of chairs facing one empty seat in the center of the room. My seat. When I placed the cake on the kitchen counter, I noticed my hands were steady, but my throat felt tight. And for one humiliating second, I thought I might cry in front of all those people. Not from guilt, from shock. 70 years old, and I was being introduced to a version of myself I did not recognize. "You control us with money," Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Every time you help, it comes with strings. You make us feel small." Daniel nodded, his jaw set, and unfolded his papers as if preparing to submit evidence. I could feel the room leaning toward them, not physically, but emotionally, the way people lean toward a story when they believe they're witnessing courage. And that is when I understood the real danger of the evening. It wasn't their anger. It was the narrative. Because once a story about you is told in public, it begins to live on its own. 3 months earlier, I would have been blindsided. But 3 months earlier, I overheard something that changed the way I listened to my children. I had returned home early from choir practice and stopped in the hallway when I heard Rebecca say, "We'll do it on her birthday. She won't refuse if she thinks it's a party." Daniel replied, calm and deliberate, "We need people there, witnesses, so she can't twist it." And then my daughter added, almost casually, "We should record it. People need to see how manipulative parents operate." I stood there in the dim light, coat still on my shoulders, feeling my pulse in my ears. I did not confront them. I did not cry. I stepped back outside, sat in my car in my own driveway, and realized something I had never imagined I would need to realize. My children were preparing to manage my character publicly. Now, here's the part that will not make me look entirely innocent. After their father died, I did help them financially. I paid Rebecca's overdue mortgage more than once. I covered Daniel's failed investment when the bank refused to extend him further credit. I sold a pair of gold earrings that had belonged to my mother. But I also asked questions. I asked why Rebecca's husband kept upgrading their car while claiming they were struggling. I asked Daniel why every opportunity required just one more bridge loan. I asked because I was afraid of watching them build lives on sand. Perhaps my questions felt like judgment. Perhaps my concern felt like supervision. There is a thin, dangerous line between helping and hovering, and I cannot pretend I never stepped over it. What they never mention, however, is the one time I said no. Last spring, Daniel asked me to refinance this house so he could invest in another venture. He said it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I looked at the paperwork, at the risks, at the fine print that tied my home to his gamble, and I said no. It was the first time in his adult life that I refused him. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply said, "You've never believed in me," and left. That was the beginning of something colder than anger. That was the beginning of distance. A week later, Rebecca asked if I would put her name on the deed, for simplicity, later. Later. That word again. I declined. Gently, but clearly. I told her this house was my security, not a future inheritance to be pre-divided. She smiled tightly and said she understood. She did not understand. So when I walked into that living room on my 70th birthday and saw 40 chairs arranged like pews, when I saw a microphone where my coffee table should have been, I knew this was not about emotional healing. It was about leverage. As my son began reading examples from my past, discouraging him from a scholarship across the country because I was afraid to lose him, questioning Rebecca's spending habits, hovering during their early marriages, I felt shame flicker in places I did not expect. In protecting Daniel from leaving too soon, perhaps I clipped something he needed to grow. That truth hurt more than the accusation. It would have been easier if they were entirely wrong. But here is what they did not know. While they were preparing speeches, I was making decisions. 2 months ago, after that hallway conversation, I met quietly with my attorney. I updated my will. I restructured my assets. I documented every transfer I had made to them over the last 5 years. Not because I wanted revenge, because I realized something that frightened me more than humiliation. If I remained passive, the story of my life would be rewritten without me. So as my daughter finished her speech and looked at me expectantly, as my son prepared to list childhood grievances in front of neighbors who once asked me for recipes, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not panic, clarity. They believed they were exposing me. They believed tonight would pressure me into compliance. They believed witnesses would corner me. What they did not understand was that when you corner a 70-year-old woman who has already buried a husband, balanced a household on one salary, and survived more silence than applause, you should be very certain she has nowhere else to turn, because sometimes, when you try to put your mother on trial, you forget that she knows where every document is buried. And I had not come into that room unprepared. Daniel didn't begin reading immediately. He adjusted the microphone first, then straightened the papers in his hand, then cleared his throat the way his father used to before announcing serious news at the dinner table. That small familiarity almost undid me. Then he said, "We've organized this so it's clear." And that was when I understood this was not an emotional outburst. It was a presentation. The examples were chronological, dated, rehearsed. He described my discouraging him from accepting the out-of-state scholarship as sabotaging independence. He described my frequent calls during Rebecca's first year of marriage as monitoring behavior. He described my financial assistance as leverage disguised as love. Each statement landed softly, but the accumulation created weight. The room responded not with shock, but with recognition. Patterns are powerful when arranged neatly. There is a particular kind of humiliation that comes from hearing your intentions translated into motives you never carried. I did discourage the scholarship, but because his father had just come home from the hospital, and I was terrified of navigating fear alone. I did call Rebecca often, because I heard strain in her voice and remembered how quietly I once endured strain myself. I did ask questions about money because I knew exactly how fragile security can be. But fear rarely announces itself as fear. It often disguises itself as interference. As Daniel continued, I noticed how careful he was to pause after certain phrases, allowing the audience to absorb them. Emotional pressure. Pause. Financial conditioning. Pause. Withholding approval. The words were modern, therapeutic, sharp. Rebecca stepped in occasionally, reinforcing the narrative, explaining how my refusal to refinance the house proved I cared more about property than about Daniel's future, how updating legal documents without consulting them was secretive. The structure was impressive. I will give them that. They had built a case not just to confront me, but to convince others. And then Daniel said it plainly, without softness. The real issue started when Mom stopped cooperating. Cooperating. Not when I yelled, not when I punished. When I stopped cooperating, the air shifted, because now the story was no longer about my past behavior. It was about my recent resistance. Rebecca stepped forward. You changed the will without telling us. A murmur passed through the chairs. She didn't say it angrily. She said it wounded. That made it more effective. You met with an attorney and restructured everything. After everything we've been through as a family. The implication was clear. My autonomy was betrayal. That was when something inside me stopped shrinking. 3 months earlier, I had stood in my hallway and overheard them planning this night. I had heard Daniel say, "We need witnesses so she can't twist it." I had heard Rebecca say, "If we pressure her publicly, she'll give in." They thought I didn't know. They believed this evening would corner me into signing something, into softening something, into reversing something. And perhaps I would have, once. But not after that conversation. Daniel finished his final page and said, "We just want transparency." The room exhaled approvingly, because transparency sounds noble. It sounds ethical. It sounds like healing. But transparency without context is theater. I leaned forward slightly and asked, very calmly, "Transparency about what, Daniel?" The question unsettled him. He blinked, just briefly. Rebecca answered instead, "About what you're planning to do with the house." There it was again. The house. Always the house. Always the house. And in that moment, I saw it clearly. They weren't confronting my personality. They were confronting my unpredictability. For decades, I had been consistent, reliable, accessible. The moment I became independent, I became suspicious. Daniel's composure cracked just slightly when I didn't respond immediately. "You've always said this house is security," he said, voice tightening. "But it feels like you use it as a threat." A threat? I almost smiled at the irony. The only time this house became threatening was when I stopped offering pieces of it in advance. I folded my hands in my lap and let the silence stretch just long enough for discomfort to bloom. Then I said quietly, "Are you finished?" He hesitated. That hesitation was the first crack in the structure they built. Because they expected resistance, they did not expect readiness. And that was when I reached into my purse. When I removed the folder from my purse, Daniel's confidence faltered in a way he tried to disguise by stepping closer, as if proximity would restore control. The folder was thin, unremarkable, beige. It did not look like revenge. It looked administrative. and that made it more dangerous. You're right, I said calmly. I updated my will. I did not rush. But before we discuss that, since we're requesting transparency, let's begin with numbers. Rebecca's expression shifted instantly. Numbers are harder to argue with than emotions. I began reading plainly, without performance. Dates, transfers, totals, mortgage rescues, business consolidations, emergency coverage. $104,000 over 5 years. I did not emphasize the amount. I let it sit in the center of the room. Someone in the third row actually inhaled sharply. Daniel tried to interrupt, but I lifted a hand gently. You said you wanted clarity, I reminded him. My generosity had become your expectation, I continued, and this time my voice did not waver. And when I declined to refinance this house, when I declined to pre-divide what is not yet inheritance, I became obstructive. Daniel's jaw tightened visibly now. His rehearsed posture was slipping. Rebecca looked between him and me, recalculating. Then I opened the second section of the folder. I did more than update the will, I said. After overhearing your conversation about pressuring me publicly, I requested something else. The room froze. Daniel's head snapped up. Rebecca went pale. They had not expected that word. Overhearing. Yes, I continued evenly. I heard you planning this. Silence fell so completely that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. And, because I was advised to document any attempt at coercion regarding property, I ensured that conversation was preserved. Daniel's face drained of color. You recorded us? His voice cracked on the last word. No, I said softly. I didn't need to. I let that linger half a second before adding, your voices carried clearly enough in my own hallway, but I did consult my attorney immediately after, and I added a clause. The word clause changed everything. Rebecca whispered, What clause? I held their gaze steadily. Any attempt to publicly pressure, coerce, or manipulate property decisions during my lifetime results in automatic reduction of inheritance share by half. A collective gasp moved through the chairs like wind through leaves. Daniel actually staggered back a step, as if something had physically struck him. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. You can't do that, Daniel said, but the certainty was gone. It sounded smaller now, frightened. I already did, I replied quietly, 2 months ago. The room no longer leaned toward them. It leaned toward me. I did not create that clause to punish you, I continued, and now my voice carried something firmer than calm. I created it to protect myself from exactly this. I gestured gently at the chairs, the microphone, the banner that read, We love you enough to be honest. You invited witnesses to corner me. Instead, you invited witnesses to consequence. Rebecca's composure fractured. We were trying to help you, she insisted weakly. No, I said softly. You were trying to secure yourselves. Daniel's breathing had grown uneven. The neat stack of papers in his hand trembled slightly now. The organized accusation had dissolved into improvisation. So what, you're just cutting us out? He demanded, but there was no longer authority in the question, only fear. I am not cutting you out, I replied. I am correcting an imbalance. I closed the folder carefully. The house will be placed in a trust, a portion to each of you, a significant portion to a scholarship in your father's name. And if tonight is interpreted legally as coercion, the reduction clause activates. That was the moment the room understood. This was no longer an emotional intervention. It was a miscalculation. Daniel looked around as if searching for support, but what he found were neighbors avoiding his eyes. Rebecca's tears now looked different, not righteous, not wounded, but uncertain. And I realized something profound in that silence. Boundaries, when introduced after years of giving, feel like betrayal to those who benefited from your silence. They thought they were putting me on trial. Instead, they had walked into a contract they never read. And for the first time that evening, no one was looking at me like I was toxic. They were looking at me like I was prepared. And I was not finished yet. There is a kind of silence that follows exposure. But this was not the hollow, reflective kind I had hoped for. It was sharper than that, thinner, like glass under pressure. After I mentioned the clause, after Daniel staggered back and Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth, the room did not relax. It recalibrated. People shifted in their folding chairs, not sure whether they were still witnessing an intervention or the beginning of something legally dangerous. The banner on the wall, "We love you enough to be honest," now looked less like courage and more like miscalculation. Daniel tried to recover first, but this time he didn't sound steady. "This isn't coercion," he said quickly. Too quickly. We're talking. Families talk." The microphone amplified the slight break in his voice, and that small betrayal of control echoed louder than anything he had said earlier. He looked toward the neighbors, searching for affirmation, but what he found instead were guarded expressions. Witnesses behave differently when they realize they may actually be witnesses. Rebecca stepped forward, tears forming again. But this time they weren't strategic. They were reactive. "You're threatening us," she said, and there was something almost panicked in it. "You're using legal language to scare us." That accusation hung in the air, and for a brief second I considered softening, stepping back, reassuring. But then I remembered the hallway conversation. I remembered the phrase, "pressure her publicly." I remembered sitting in my car in my own driveway, realizing my children were designing a moment to corner me. "I didn't introduce lawyers into this room," I said evenly. "You introduced leverage." That landed harder than I expected. Daniel's face tightened, and for the first time anger replaced calculation. "We were trying to protect our future," he snapped. There it was. Not healing. Not emotional safety. Future security. "By securing it before I'm gone?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation said everything. Rebecca's voice came softer now, but more cutting. "You stopped trusting us." That one pierced differently. Not because it was entirely true, but because it wasn't entirely false. "I stopped trusting the pressure," I replied. "There's a difference." Daniel began pacing, faster now, the neat stack of papers bending in his grip. "You think we were going to steal from you?" he demanded. The word steal made a few neighbors visibly uncomfortable. No one had used language that raw until now. "I think," I said slowly, "that when inheritance becomes urgent during someone's lifetime, something fundamental has shifted." I let that sit. "And I think urgency is rarely about love." Rebecca shook her head, but her expression flickered with something else. Fear. Not moral fear. Financial fear. "You don't understand," she said under her breath. "Then explain it to me," I replied. Silence. Daniel stopped pacing. Rebecca avoided my eyes. And that was when the crack widened. Daniel exhaled sharply and said, "We already made decisions, assuming the house would eventually be divided equally. The words came out reluctantly, as if dragged. The room tightened instantly. I used projected inheritance in a financial planning discussion, he admitted. It wasn't final. It was hypothetical. Hypothetical. The neighbors shifted again, but this time differently. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, then added in a rush, "We thought it was safe to plan around. You always said it would be ours one day." And there it was. Not theft. Not villainy. Assumption. Expectations solidified into financial planning. I felt something cold and steady settle in my chest. "So tonight," I said carefully, "wasn't about emotional healing." Neither of them answered. Because it wasn't. It was about correcting a variable that had disrupted a projection. The power shift in the room became undeniable. Not because I had won, but because the underlying motive had surfaced without my forcing it. They had revealed it themselves. One of the neighbors in the back quietly lowered her phone. I hadn't even noticed she'd been holding it up. That was the moment I realized. This was no longer about humiliation. It was about exposure. And exposure changes relationships permanently. But the evening still had one more fracture left in it. Because there was something they had not yet admitted, even to each other. And I was done protecting their silence. "You didn't just assume," I said calmly, watching Daniel's face. "You calculated." He looked at me sharply, defensive again, but the edge was unstable now. And when I changed the will, I disrupted more than expectation. I disrupted a financial model. Rebecca's voice trembled. "That's not fair." "No," I agreed quietly. "It isn't." The room stilled again, but this time it wasn't waiting for legal consequences. It was waiting for truth. "I wrote checks instead of asking for company," I continued, my voice steady but not theatrical. "I made myself useful so I wouldn't feel unnecessary after your father died. That was my mistake." Daniel's posture shifted slightly, but I did not let him interrupt. "But you made a mistake too. You began building futures that included assets still attached to a living person." Rebecca's tears fell again, but now they carried embarrassment. "We weren't trying to hurt you." "I know," I said. "You were trying to feel secure." Daniel looked at the floor for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice had lost its earlier volume. "You don't understand how unstable things feel right now," he admitted. "Investments aren't stable. Markets shift. Debt piles quietly. Knowing the house was there, it made things less terrifying." That was the most honest sentence he had spoken all night. "And knowing you needed me," I replied gently, "made my loneliness less terrifying." The symmetry of it landed heavy. We weren't fighting over property. We were medicating fear with assumption. Rebecca stood abruptly then, not in anger but in agitation. She walked to the wall and tore down the banner in one sudden motion. The paper ripped loudly, dramatically, far louder than the clause had sounded. The phrase, "We love you enough to be honest," crumpled in her hands. "That was stupid," she muttered, and it wasn't clear whether she meant the banner or the entire evening. No one stopped her. No one clapped. Daniel looked smaller now. Not defeated, but destabilized. "So what happens to us?" he asked quietly. That question was no longer about inheritance. It was about identity. "What happens," I said carefully, "is that we stop building futures on assets we don't yet own." I paused, then added, "And we see whether we still know how to speak to each other without leverage." Rebecca let the torn banner fall to the floor. Daniel glanced toward the neighbors, then toward the door, and for the first time all night, he looked uncertain about who had truly been on trial. "I am still your mother," I said softly, "but I am no longer your contingency plan." That line did not resolve the room, it unsettled it, because contingency plans are comforting, and removing one forces growth. One by one, neighbors began leaving, but not quietly this time. There were brief, awkward glances, a murmured, "Good night," a hesitation at the doorway, the kind of exits that suggest something irreversible has occurred. Daniel remained standing in the center of the room, staring at the folder on the coffee table. Rebecca stood near the torn banner, breathing unevenly. And for the first time that evening, none of us knew what tomorrow's conversation would look like. Not because of the clause, not because of the trust, but because the safety net had shifted. And when a safety net moves, people either learn to balance or they fall. I did not know which my children would choose. And that uncertainty, more than any legal document, was the real consequence of tonight. The morning after felt brighter than it should have, the sunlight pressing through the curtains as if nothing had shifted, as if 40 witnesses had not sat in my living room the night before while my children tried to correct me. The folding chairs were still stacked near the wall, uneven, slightly scuffed from being dragged across the rug. The torn banner lay on the coffee table, one corner hanging off the edge like something unfinished. I stood there longer than necessary, looking at the room not as a battlefield, but as evidence that something irreversible had occurred. By noon, the quiet began to carry weight. A neighbor who usually waved crossed the street instead. Another texted a careful message about family healing, which read less like comfort and more like distance. Exposure lingers in small communities. It doesn't explode, it settles. I could feel it settling. Daniel arrived just after 2. He didn't knock immediately, which told me he was debating whether to enter as a son or as a negotiator. When he finally stepped inside, he didn't sit. He stood near the doorway and said without greeting, "You could have handled that differently." His voice was controlled again, but thinner than before, as if it had lost some internal reinforcement. "So could you," I replied. He exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "You changed the power dynamic in one night," he said. That word again. Power. It hovered between us like a diagnosis. "I removed an assumption," I answered. He paced once across the living room, glancing briefly at the stacked chairs. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone. You attempted to corner me in front of everyone." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue that point. Instead, he said something quieter, something less rehearsed. "I already submitted projections to a lender." The words came out carefully, as if admitting something fragile. They asked about long-term assets. I listed future inheritance as potential collateral stability. There it was. Not greed. Infrastructure. He had built part of his financial credibility on something that did not yet belong to him. "And if the clause reduces your share?" I asked evenly. "It affects approval," he said. Not dramatically, just factually. For the first time since the intervention, I felt something close to doubt flicker inside me. Not about the clause, but about timing. I had known there would be emotional backlash. I had not calculated institutional consequences. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the strain beneath the frustration. He was not only losing expectation, he was losing leverage in rooms I would never enter. "You're asking me to undo it," I said quietly. I'm asking if you would consider it, he replied. And this time there was no edge, only urgency. The silence that followed was heavier than anything the night before. I could remove the clause. I could smooth this. I could restore the projection he had already submitted. The power to relieve his pressure sat entirely with me. I won't, I said. He closed his eyes briefly, absorbing that. Not rage, not shock, just consequence. You always told us you'd protect us, he said finally. I am, I answered. Just not the way you expected. That was when he said the one thing I had not prepared for. Rebecca's talking about stepping back for a while, he muttered. From you, from visits, from bringing the kids around. That landed deeper than lender projections ever could. She said the house doesn't feel the same, he added. And there it was. The cost. Not money. Access. After he left, I sat alone in the living room staring at the torn banner again. For a brief, unwitnessed moment, I allowed myself to wonder whether I had moved too sharply, whether protection sometimes feels indistinguishable from rejection. The doubt was small, but it was real. I let it exist for exactly as long as it needed to. Then I stood up and began folding the chairs myself. Rebecca did not call for 3 days. On the 4th evening, she sent a message that simply read, "The kids are confused. No accusation, no warmth, just information." I called immediately, but she didn't answer. Instead, she arrived the next afternoon without them. She stood in the driveway with her arms folded, not defensively, but tightly, as if holding something in place. "Daniel told you about the lender," she said before I could speak. "Yes." "He shouldn't have used the house like that," she admitted, surprising me. "But you didn't have to make it permanent." "It was already permanent," I replied. "You just didn't see it yet." She looked away at that, jaw tightening. "The kids asked if you're mad at us," she said. "They heard enough that night to know something broke." Something broke, not shifted. Broke. I felt that word settle inside me carefully. "Are you planning to keep them away?" I asked. "I don't know," she answered honestly, and that honesty was more unsettling than anger would have been. "It depends on whether this becomes a war." "It's not a war," I said. "It's a boundary." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Boundaries feel like walls when you're on the other side. That was the mess I had been waiting for. Not philosophy, not symmetry. Impact. "Maybe," I said quietly, "but walls exist when people try to push through doors." She stared at me, hurt flickering across her face. "You think we were pushing through you? I think you were leaning on me harder than I could carry." For a moment, neither of us spoke. A car passed slowly down the street, the driver glancing over just slightly too long. "Consequences don't stay inside houses. They ripple." Rebecca's voice softened. "Daniel might lose the approval." "I know. And if that happens?" "Then he adjusts." She studied me carefully. "You really won't step in?" That question was not accusatory. It was fearful. "No," I said. She inhaled slowly, and for the first time, I saw not entitlement, not manipulation, but recalibration. "Then we'll have to figure it out," she murmured. "Yes," I replied. "You will." Before leaving, she said something that shifted the ground again. "If the kids ask why things changed, what do I tell them?" I thought for a moment before answering. "Tell them Grandma decided to stop being a safety net and start being a person." She absorbed that in silence. When she finally turned to leave, She hesitated. I don't know what this makes us, she admitted. It makes you adults, I said gently. She didn't respond. As she drove away, I stood in the driveway longer than necessary, aware that something tangible had been altered. The house felt larger, quieter, not victorious, just different. Daniel might lose financing. Rebecca might reduce visits. Neighbors might continue whispering. These were not dramatic punishments. They were adjustments, and adjustments are uncomfortable. Inside, I placed the folder back in its drawer, not as a weapon, but as documentation of a line that now existed. For the first time since my husband died, my children were standing without the guarantee of my intervention. And for the first time since they were born, I was allowing that to happen. Whether that choice would fracture us permanently or finally separate love from leverage was no longer something I could calculate. And this time, I would not revise the numbers to make everyone feel safe. The call from the bank did not come with drama. It came with formality. And somehow that felt more invasive. The man introduced himself politely, verified my identity twice, then explained that my name had surfaced in a financial stability review connected to my son's pending expansion loan. He did not accuse. He did not imply wrongdoing. But when institutions say they need clarification, it means something has shifted on paper. He asked whether my property had been placed into a conditional trust structure that affected projected inheritance stability. Hearing my private boundary translated into institutional language felt like watching a personal conversation placed under fluorescent lighting. I answered yes, calmly, and he thanked me in the neutral tone of someone who would now enter a note into a system that would alter a decision. After I hung up, I did not move for several minutes. The house felt smaller, as if the walls had overheard. I had drawn the line to protect myself. But now that line existed in spreadsheets I would never see. I told myself that consequences were necessary, that adulthood required friction, that stability built on assumption was fragile by design. I told myself many reasonable things. Reason does not quiet maternal instinct. Daniel called that evening, and there was no attempt at composure this time. They flagged it, he said immediately, voice tight, breath uneven. They want revised asset certainty. They specifically mentioned conditional inheritance language. He was not asking how I felt. He was reporting damage. I listened without interrupting. You knew this would ripple, he added. And this time it was not accusation, it was disbelief. I knew it could, I replied. You didn't think to warn me? He asked. That question landed harder than the lender had. I had not warned him because I believed he should not have built on it, but hearing it framed as omission forced something uncomfortable into view. I had protected myself. I had not protected his timing. You built projections without confirming permanence, I said carefully. I built projections because you said for years the house would be ours. He shot back. And now the emotion returned, not theatrical, but wounded. You changed the terms without considering what I had already structured. There it was. Not entitlement. Dependence disguised as planning. I changed the terms because I overheard you planning to corner me. I answered, quieter now. Silence followed, but this time it was not strategic. It was raw. If this falls through, he said finally, it's not just expansion, it's reputation. I've positioned myself based on growth. People are watching. That word again. Watching. The same word that defined the intervention night. People were watching me too, I said softly. He did not respond. After we hung up, I walked through the living room and paused where the folding chairs had once been. For the first time since introducing the clause, doubt pressed harder than confidence. Not about the boundary, about the cost. Was this the moment he would begin measuring me, not as a mother, but as an obstacle? I had insisted on adulthood. Now adulthood was arriving, and it was not gentle. 3 days later, Rebecca sent a short message. He thinks you care more about proving a point than helping. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Proving a point. Was that what this looked like from the outside? The boundary had clarity for me. For them, it looked like defiance. That was when I realized something sobering. Holding firm feels principled internally. It feels punitive externally. And there was no version of this where both perceptions aligned. The denial came 2 weeks later, not with drama, but with a formal email. Daniel forwarded to me without commentary. The subject line alone carried enough finality. When he arrived that evening, he did not pace. He did not argue. He did not negotiate. He sat down heavily, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like someone recalculating identity. "It's done," he said simply. They declined. Asset instability. Conditional inheritance risk. He almost laughed at the phrasing, but there was no humor in it. They said if the projected distribution were fixed and unconditional, the risk profile would have improved. He let that sit between us. I felt the familiar instinct rise, the urge to fix, to amend, to relieve pressure before it hardened into resentment. The clause sat in my mind like a door I could still unlock. I could call the attorney. I could adjust language. I could restore his projection and pretend this lesson had been sufficient. "You could still revise it," he said quietly, not looking at me. There it was, the invitation. For a long moment, I did not answer. Because this was no longer about leverage. It was about whether I could tolerate being the reason something difficult happened to my son. I had always intervened before difficulty fully landed. This was the first time I was allowing gravity to complete its work. "If I revise it now," I said slowly, "what do you learn?" He lifted his head then, eyes tired, not furious. "That you still have my back." "And if I don't?" He hesitated. That hesitation mattered. "That I have to build differently," he admitted, without assuming. The room felt suspended. "I am not your obstacle," I said quietly. "I am your mother, but I am no longer your financial infrastructure." That line did not sound triumphant. It sounded heavy. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I hate that this is how I learn it," he said. "So do I answered honestly. That was the first time since the intervention that our discomfort aligned. He stood to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Rebecca's keeping the kids home this weekend," he added. "She says things still feel tense." It was not said to punish. It was said to inform. And that was the real cost, not lender rejection. Distance. After he left, the house felt unusually quiet. I walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table, the same place where I had once written checks without thinking twice. I allowed myself 1 full minute of doubt. 1 minute where I imagined removing the clause, restoring ease, smoothing friction. It would be simple. It would be immediate. It would feel loving. But it would also return us to assumption. I stood up before the minute could become a decision. The clause remained. The trust remained. The denial remained. And so did the tension. Daniel would rebuild slower now, or he would blame me longer. Rebecca would either bring the children back into the house as if nothing had shifted, or she would maintain distance to signal disapproval. I could not predict which path they would choose. For the first time in decades, their future was not something I could edit. And that is what made this moment heavier than the intervention, heavier than the public humiliation, heavier than the clause itself. I was no longer financing outcomes. I was allowing them to live inside the consequences of their own projections. Whether that strengthened us or fractured something quietly over time was no longer within my control. And that uncertainty, more than any legal document, was the true inheritance I had handed them.